Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to use frame of motion to add animation to our code component. You might have noticed in the final version of the component, we have this animate toggle that allows us to set a start mask and an end mask to animate between. And that allows us to do stuff like this cool fade-in animation. But in order to do this, we need to understand a little bit about how frame of motion works. So to do that, I created this little demo component, which is basically just the default template, but I've added a bunch more property controls down here. If we look at this component on the canvas, we have this from object over here, where we can set rotation, X, Y, and scale. And this is the initial state of the animation. So if I tweak some of these properties, then we have this to object, which is the final state of the animation. So if I tweak a couple of those, and then in between them, we can set the transition. So how it goes from one state to the other. So I'm just going to make the time 1 second. And then if I preview this, you can see that it animates from the from state to the to state using our transition. And that's kind of the core way to think about animation in frame of motion. We have an initial state, and then we have an end state, and we have a transition that guides us between them. Back in our component, let's look at how this all works. You can see we're importing motion from frame of motion, and then we're using this motion to create a motion div by writing motion.div. And you can basically prepend motion to any HTML element to add animation to it. If I go ahead and take away this motion.div and just make it a normal div, you'll see that it starts to throw an error because these aren't native HTML attributes. They're part of the frame of motion library. Okay, so how do we set the initial state of our animation? You can see at the top, I'm destructuring from props, and from is this object of property controls where we have rotate, X, Y, and scale. And then we're just sort of passing those into the style of our motion.div. So you might have noticed that things like X and Y aren't actually CSS properties, but Framer provides them as a sort of shorthand for writing something like translate X. Instead, we can just write X and then give it a value. So if I write 200 here, you can see that it offsets this by 200 for the initial state of the animation. If I remove the animate attribute quickly, you can see that when we edit this, it moves the initial state. And we could do the same for something like rotate. So the way we set our initial state is fairly simple. We just pass it into style. And then the way we set the end state of our animation is by passing the same sort of properties into the animate attribute. You can see here I'm spreading in all of the properties from the to object, which we've specified down here. And you can see if I edit this, just add those in here instead, it changes the end state of our animation. And then you'll notice that we're setting a transition here by passing in this transition property. And down here, we have a special property control for controlling the transition. But we could also write the transition by hand. So instead of transition here, we could write transition. And we could specify something like the duration here. We can make it 2 seconds. So now it happens a lot slower. We can also specify stuff like easing curves here. So I can write ease and then ease out. We could also make our animation repeat. So we could write repeat and then we can give it a number, which will specify how many times to repeat. So we'll say 4, and we can say repeat type. I'll just say loop. So you can see that when it gets to the end, it just jumps straight back to the start. So maybe we want to say mirror here instead, and it should play sort of in reverse. And maybe we want this to just keep playing. So instead of 4, we can write infinity here. So now you're getting a sense of what you can configure when you use this transition interface over here. Okay, cool. So if we reset that so that transition is passed in here. So far, we just animated the box from a start state to an end state when it appears. But frame of motion also provides these gesture helpers like while hover, which allows us to animate when we interact with the component. So you can see here now it rotates 90 degrees, but I could pass these same properties into while hover, and you can see they're being applied. There's a couple other gestures, but the other important one is while tap. And now the animation only plays when I tap on the item. You can also combine these two. So if we add this animate back and remove some of this, and we want this to rotate 180 now, you can see that it still plays the appear animation. And then when I tap on it, it plays to this while tap animation. You can kind of think of that as like a third state in the animation tree. Okay, so we've covered the basics of frame of motion in this little component. Let's go add animation to our gradient mask. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're importing frame of motion, and simply go down and write motion.div here. And we just need to make sure that the end tag matches the opening tag. So add motion.div down there. Now we don't need to add motion to the image because all of our animation will take place up here. But if you needed to animate the image, you could just write write something like motion.image. Now, because we're going to add a from state for our mask and an end state for our mask, we actually need to rework this a little bit. So let's rename this property to start mask and press save. And you'll see that that breaks everything because we've renamed this mask to start mask. So we'll write start mask here and it should work. But we actually don't want to pull these properties out of here anymore because when we add our end mask, there'll be naming conflicts. So let's just comment those out. And what we're going to do is add start mask dot direction here and do the same for all of these properties. And we just got to remove these brackets here because otherwise it won't recognize start mask. And you see that that broke things because I misspelled this start opacity here. Cool. Now all we need to do is basically copy this start mask object and duplicate it, and we're going to rename it to end mask, and then we'll pull that out of here and we can remove all of these. And then on our motion.div we just need to add another property called animate. And we can copy our WebKit mask image into here, and instead of start mask, we're going to say end mask. Now, notice that nothing's happening. There is no animation playing over here. And that's because start mask and end mask have the same default values. And this is one of the smart things about frame of motion. If it detects that there's no change between properties, it just doesn't animate them. So we don't have to worry about a performance hit. And we can use that to our advantage a little bit later on. But to test out that everything's working, let's change the default value here to be 0. Now you can see that when I press refresh, it animates the mask from 180 to 0 degrees. And it's doing it using the default transition. But of course we need to add a transition. So let's add one here. We're going to give it a type of control type transition. And really that's all we have to do. Just add a comma here. And now when we drag our component in, you can see that we have a start mask, an end mask, and a transition. But we need to go hook up that transition. We just need to pull transition out of here like so, and then pass it into our motion.div using the transition property. Like that. And now when we go back to our component, we can set a really long 4-second duration on this animation. And when we preview it, you can see it plays over 4 seconds. Now I actually want to be able to toggle this animation on or off. So let's go back and add a animate toggle. So we can add a property control over here called animate. And we're going to give it a type of control type.boolean. And we'll give it a default value of false. And then we need to hide our end mask depending on whether or not animate is toggled. So we'll just copy this sort of hidden code over here. We want to do the same for transition. So we can say hidden props.animate equals false. And that will hide that control when animate is set to false. And we want to do the same for this guy over here. Now when we go back to our control, you can see we toggle animate on and off, and our controls are hiding. And then we actually need to pass that animate toggle down. So we'll say animate, and let's just make this a little bit wider. And then in the animate property, we're going to say if animate is true, then animate to the end mask, else animate to this mask, which will basically mean there is no animation because the start state and the end state will be identical. So now if we go back and test this out, you can see that I've got animation set to no. So I preview that and there's nothing happening. And then if I switch this over to yes and preview that, now it's animating. Okay, so that's pretty much all the animation we need for our component. But before we wrap things up, I kind of want to show you another way of animating things in frame of motion. To do that, let's hop back over to our motion component. So up until now, we've just animated stuff from a start state to an end state. But you're going to come across situations where you need to animate between more than just 2 states. And to do that, you can use variants in frame of motion, which work pretty similarly to variants in Framer itself. So to show you how this works, I'm just going to create a const over here called variants. And it's going to be an object. And then in that object, we're going to have a key for each state we want to animate between. So you can call this whatever you want, but I'm just going to call it 1 for now. Open up the brackets and let's just animate the rotation. And then I'm just going to duplicate this a bunch of times and give them each a different key. So that could be 2, 3, and 4. And let's just add a comma between all of them. So we want this one to be 0, and then it's going to animate to 45, and then to 135, and maybe let's just make this last one 180. And then to use those variants, there's an attribute called variants. So we just pass it in like so. And then to set the initial state, we have a couple of options. We can carry on using style, so we can say variants.1. like that, or we can use the initial prop, which will set the initial state of the animation. And then here we just specify the variant we want to use, and we just enter it as a string. So we can just say 1. Now when I play that, you can see it's going from 0 degrees to 45 degrees. So it's going from 1 to this animate state we've specified. But we actually want to use a variant here. So we're just going to get rid of that. And then we're going to specify 2. And now you can see that that's just rotating 45 degrees because it's going from 1 to 2. But I could set this to 3. And here you could do something like some prop and animate to that value or animate to that value. So you can dynamically change which of these variants you need to animate to. But we can also use these variants in gestures. So now I can say 4 here, and then I'll do 2 while hover. So now when I hover over it, it animates to 45 degrees. When I tap it, it animates to 180. So this is just a simple demo of how to use variants to control complex animation trees. But that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed making this silly little component with me, and I hope you learned a lot about building code components in Framer. Happy building, and thanks for watching.